Minasan konnichiwa und willkommen. And today we're going to be talking about the differences and the history of the Super Nintendo Entertainment System / Super Famicom versus the Sega Genesis / Sega Mega Drive. But before I even do the video, I'd like to give a special thank you to Erik Peter Carlson and his wife Monica Carlson. They helped me make my dreams come true. When Erik got Cinderella to dance with him and got her to give me a special shout out, I felt really emotional. So Erik and Monica, I thank you for all your hard work and appreciation. And I'll never ever forget it. Anyway, let's start the video, shall we? Both the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis both have 16 computer bits of data, since they're both 16-bit machines. The Super Nintendo has 2.668 megahertz of RAM, while the Sega Genesis has 7.67 megahertz. Because it's called blast processing in those aggressive commercials. The Super Nintendo had like 168 kilobytes of RAM, while the Sega Genesis just has 64 kilobytes. The Super Nintendo had 32,768 colors, as in possible colors, while the Sega Genesis / Mega Drive had 512 possible colors. Nintendo had like 64 by 64 possible sprites. Or is it in terms of sprite data? While the Sega Genesis had 32 by 32. The Super Nintendo had 128 possible simultaneous sprites. The Sega Genesis has 80 simultaneous sprites. The Super Nintendo had 250 by 224 to 512 by 448, I assume, lines of resolution. The Sega Genesis only has 320 by 224. The Super Nintendo had 8-channel stereo sound, which was great for one full Super Nintendo music, like Disney's Aladdin. While the Sega Genesis had 6-channel stereo sound, great for certain games like Mortal Kombat or Sonic the Hedgehog 3, that and Sonic 3 and Knuckles. The Super Nintendo had 64 kilobytes of sound RAM. The Sega Genesis only has 8 kilobytes of sound RAM. The Sega Genesis / Sega Mega Drive first came out on October 29, 1988 in Japan, August 14, 1989 in North America, and September of 1990 in Europe and Brazil. It sold 30.75 million units worldwide. The Super Nintendo / Super Famicom was released in Japan on November 21, 1990. In North America on August 23, 1991. In Europe in June of 1992, and in Brazil in September of 1992. It sold 49.10 million units worldwide, including Germany, Japan, and Brazil. The packing games for both systems vary depending on what unit you buy. For the Sega Genesis, the original packing game was Altered Beast, as in the Sega Genesis conversion, and not the original arcade version. But the game did look pretty impressive for its time, back in 1989. Well, at least in the US. And then, around 1991, Sonic the Hedgehog came to town, around the time Super Mario World was released on the Super Nintendo / Super Famicom. So yeah, Sonic the Hedgehog became extremely popular. And then in 1992, the popular sequel, Sonic the Hedgehog 2, was released on the Sega Genesis. Well, that game was actually packaged with the Model 2 Genesis. And some Model 2s actually have Disney's Aladdin as the packing game. But the Super Nintendo version of Aladdin was better. Well, the Sega Genesis Model 2 was released in 1993. And Disney's Aladdin was heavily promoted for that particular machine. And then 4 years later, in 1997, they released the Sega Genesis Model 3. And certain games won't work for it, but it does play Japanese import games. I'm not sure about European imports like French, Spanish, or German. Now for the Super Nintendo aspect. The original Super Nintendo units came with Super Mario World, and other times Super Mario All-Stars plus Super Mario World. And Super Mario All-Stars was basically the 16-bit versions of the 8-bit classics, which are the original Super Mario Bros., Super Mario Bros. 2 USA, Super Mario Bros. 2 The Lost Levels, and Super Mario Bros. 3. And other units like the Super Nintendo 2 came with Super Mario World Yoshi's Island, which was basically a cheaper alternative to the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. When those particular Sega commercials first aired on television, those Sega commercials were primarily attacking Nintendo by saying that infamous slogan, Genesis does what Nintendo don't. Trust me, I've seen those commercials all over YouTube. And Nintendo actually fought back with their 16-bit powerhouse, which is the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, which was basically the Brock Lesnar of its day. And the Sega Genesis was like the Braun Strowman of its day. Kind of like comparing WWE to WCW, which stood for World Wrestling Entertainment and World Championship Wrestling, respectively. But we'll talk about wrestling in a future video. And that song goes like this. Genesis does what Nintendo don't. You can't do this on Nintendo. Genesis does 16-bit arcade graphics. Genesis does. Genesis does. Genesis does. Genesis does what Nintendo don't. Yep, Genesis does what Nintendo don't. Nintendo fought back with their own aggressive commercials. Super Nintendo is what Genesis isn't. But that isn't as catchy as Genesis does what Nintendo don't. Okay, that should be it for the video for today, folks. I hope you enjoyed it. Like, subscribe, comment. And as always, amigos, au revoir, auf Wiedersehen, sayonara, adios, and arrivederci.